Genesis then introduces one of its most debated sentences. Let us make man in our image, after our likeness. Who is us? Later, Christian tradition often hears the Trinity in that plural language. That is a legitimate Christian theological reading. But it is probably not how the earliest Hebrew audience understood the passage. The Hebrew Bible repeatedly describes a heavenly assembly. God stands among divine beings. The sons of God appear before him. The host of heaven surrounds the throne. A heavenly council discusses the fate of kings. Spirits receive assignments. Nations are associated with heavenly rulers. The Hebrew word Elohim can refer to the God of Israel, but in certain contexts it can also describe divine or spiritual beings. Its meaning depends on grammar and context. The biblical world is therefore not spiritually empty. It contains angels, cherubim, seraphim, spirits, watchers, messengers, princes, sons of God, and members of a heavenly host. God is supreme within that world, but he is not depicted as the only non-human intelligence in existence. Let us make man can therefore be heard as royal court language. The king announces a decree before the council. Humanity is created as the earthly image of heavenly rule. This interpretation also makes God's later statement in Eden more significant. The man has become like one of us. The same plural returns. Whatever us means in the first chapter, the beings included in it already possess the knowledge of good and evil. And after eating from the tree, humanity joins them in that knowledge. Genesis contains two creation sequences. In the first, vegetation appears. Animals appear. Humanity is created as male and female. Both receive dominion. In the second, the man is formed from dust. A garden is planted. Animals are brought to the man. The woman is built from his side. The order and emphasis are different. The divine name also changes. Genesis 1 repeatedly uses Elohim. Genesis 2 introduces the combined title commonly translated as the Lord God. Mainstream biblical scholarship generally explains these differences through distinct literary sources or traditions brought together by editors. Religious interpreters often harmonize them as a broad overview, followed by a closer account of humanity. Another possibility is symbolic. Genesis 1 describes humanity in archetypal or cosmic terms. Genesis 2 describes humanity entering a particular sacred environment. The first is creation at the level of image. The second is formation at the level of matter, land, service, law, and initiation. That interpretation cannot be proven simply from the differences. But it helps explain why Genesis 2 feels less like a repetition and more like the beginning of another stage. Humanity has been created. Now a man is formed. A garden is planted. A command is given. A boundary is established. And the test begins. Eden is usually imagined as untouched wilderness. But the text describes something more organized. A garden is planted within a larger region called Eden. A river flows outward and divides into 4 branches. Those rivers lead toward lands associated with gold, aromatic resin, and precious stones. The man is placed inside the garden to dress and keep it. The Hebrew verbs can mean work or serve, and keep or guard. The same basic language later appears in descriptions of priestly service and the guarding of sacred space. Adam is therefore not only a gardener, he resembles a priestly guardian. The garden also has an eastward orientation. After the expulsion, cherubim guard its eastern entrance. The later tabernacle and temple similarly use guarded sacred zones, eastern entrances, priestly service, cherubic imagery, precious materials, and restricted access to the divine presence. Ezekiel's imagery of Eden also connects the garden with precious stones, a holy mountain, and a guardian cherub. The parallels are strong enough that many biblical scholars describe Eden as a prototypical sanctuary. It is the first sacred space, the first place where heaven and earth meet, the first place where humanity serves in the presence of God, and the first sanctuary from which humanity is expelled. This changes how we understand the command concerning the tree. The tree is not simply a dangerous plant growing in a field. It stands within a sacred enclosure. Access to it is regulated. A priestly guardian has been given a law. A spiritual being enters. A hidden knowledge is offered. The human pair crosses the boundary, and the sanctuary closes. Before the woman is formed, the animals are brought to Adam. He names them. That sequence raises a simple but rarely discussed point. The serpent is described as one of the creatures of the field. If Adam named the animals before Eve existed, then Adam had already encountered whatever creature would later speak to her. The text never tells us what Adam called it. It never explains whether it already possessed speech. It never tells us why Adam remained silent during the encounter. Genesis states that the woman gave the fruit to her husband, who was with her. Depending on how one reads the phrase, Adam may have been present during at least part of the exchange. The traditional picture of Eve wandering off alone and being tricked while Adam remained far away is not clearly stated in the passage. Adam had received the command directly. Eve had not yet been formed when the command was first given. So who explained the rule to her? Presumably Adam. Yet when she repeats it, she adds that they must not even touch the tree. That additional restriction does not appear in God's original wording. Already the command has changed in transmission. A rule is given. A human interpreter expands it. Then another voice challenges it. This is not merely a story about appetite. It is a conflict over who correctly interprets divine law. Genesis calls the serpent Nachash. The word identifies a serpent, but related Hebrew forms are associated with divination or the interpretation of signs. Some interpreters also connect the imagery with brightness or shining, although the linguistic details are debated. What is clear is that this is no ordinary snake. It speaks. It reasons. It understands the command. It knows what the tree will do. It knows that the divine beings possess the knowledge of good and evil. And before the curse, it apparently does not move on its belly in the form familiar to us. Later biblical tradition develops a larger serpent and dragon complex. The sea serpent, Leviathan, the dragon, the ancient serpent, the adversary. Revelation explicitly combines the dragon, the ancient serpent, the devil, and Satan. But Genesis itself never directly calls the serpent Satan. That identification develops through later interpretation. We should therefore keep two categories separate. The text presents a highly intelligent serpent-like creature challenging God's command. Later tradition identifies that creature with Satan, Samael, or another rebellious spiritual power. The serpent's role is unmistakably disruptive. You shall not surely die. Adam and Eve do not physically collapse on the day they eat. Christian theology answers that spiritual death begins immediately, mortality enters their condition, or death becomes inevitable. Those are theological interpretations developed from the wider biblical story. Within Genesis itself, the immediate results are that their eyes open, they recognize their nakedness, they hide, they are judged, they are expelled, and access to immortality is blocked. The serpent gives them knowledge, but not freedom from consequences. The formation of the woman is one of the strangest births in world literature. Adam is placed into a deep sleep. God takes something from his side. The Hebrew word is often translated rib, but elsewhere commonly means a side or structural flank. The woman is then built from what is taken. This reverses natural birth. Every man ordinarily comes from a woman, but the first woman in Genesis comes from a man. Adam temporarily becomes the body from which another human being emerges. Later, Christian interpretation sees another reversed birth at the crucifixion. Christ, the last Adam, is pierced in the side. Blood and water emerge. The church is symbolically born from his wounded body. Adam's side produces Eve. Christ's side produces the church. Both women become brides. Both births involve sleep or death. Both involve an opened side. Both stand near a tree, the tree in Eden and the wood of the cross. The connection does not remove the patriarchal dimensions of the Genesis story, but it shows that the woman's formation is part of a larger symbolic pattern involving bride, body, blood, water, temple, and new creation. The tree is called the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. The woman sees that it is good for food, pleasant to the eyes, and desirable for gaining wisdom. She eats. She gives to Adam. Their eyes open. They know they are naked. The Hebrew verb to know carries a wide range of meanings. It can mean intellectual understanding, personal experience, recognition, and sexual intimacy. Adam later knows Eve, and she conceives. This does not prove that eating the fruit was a sexual act, but the narrative deliberately moves from knowledge to nakedness, from nakedness to shame, and eventually from union to birth. The event transforms consciousness and sexuality at the same time. Before eating, they are naked and unashamed. After eating, nakedness becomes something they interpret, cover, and hide. Knowledge creates self-awareness. Self-awareness creates separation. They no longer experience themselves innocently. They see themselves from the outside. That is one meaning of initiation. The initiate crosses a boundary and cannot return to the former state of innocence. Knowledge cannot be unknown. The eyes cannot be closed in the same way again. The serpent does not merely tempt them with pleasure. It offers a change in being. You will be like the divine beings. And God later confirms that the human has become like one of us in knowing good and evil. The disagreement is not over whether knowledge was gained. The disagreement concerns whether humanity was ready, authorized, or entitled to take it. For much of Christian history, Eve became the symbol of female weakness, sexual temptation, disobedience, and deception. Her punishment includes pain in childbirth and domination by her husband. Later writers used the story to justify restrictions on women's teaching, authority, independence, and sexuality. But the narrative distributes responsibility more widely than many retellings admit. Adam receives the command. Adam is present in the garden. Adam eats. Adam blames the woman. The woman blames the serpent. The serpent is cursed. The ground is cursed because of Adam. All three participate. Yet culturally, Eve often carries the heaviest symbolic burden. The entire female sex becomes associated with the action of one woman, while Adam remains the father and representative of humanity. This is part of what can reasonably be called the suppression of the feminine. Not because Genesis secretly teaches a modern political ideology, but because later institutions repeatedly emphasize the woman's guilt while minimizing her relationship to wisdom, life, motherhood, and transformation. Eve's name is connected with life. She becomes the mother of all living. The figure blamed for death also bears the title of Universal Mother. That tension should not be erased.